Okay, let's continue on with the female reproductive structures. All right, so in the males, we talked about how there were reproductive ducts, and those included the ductus deferens, the ejaculatory duct, and the urethra. And so in the females, we have a system of ducts as well. Now, unlike, or the epididymis also in the male was part of the male duct system. Now, unlike in the male, the epididymis is physically connected to a testis. In the female, the fallopian tube that you see right here, or the oviduct or ovarian uterine tube, it actually does not physically contact the ovary. On the anatomy side, we have talked about how this wider section of the fallopian tube is called the infundibulum. And then you've got these finger-like projections called fimbriae or fimbriae that kind of cup the ovary, and they're there to help guide when a oocyte gets ovulated out of an ovary. They help guide the oocyte in here so it can start its journey down the fallopian tube. Sometimes an oocyte misses the infundibulum here. It gets past the fimbriae and goes floating off into the abdominopelvic cavity. And so you may have heard before about women who actually have developing fetuses embedded on other organs in the abdominopelvic cavity, like the intestinal tract, for example. And that occurs when sperm cells swim their way up through the uterus, through the fallopian tube. They swim their way out and get into the woman's abdominopelvic cavity, and they home in on a oocyte that's floating around in there. You can have fertilization take place in the abdominopelvic cavity, and then if that attaches to another organ, you can have implantation and development of a placenta, and the pregnancy can develop attached to a different organ. Now, those are extremely rare situations when those happen. All right, so after the fallopian tube, you have the uterus, the womb, and that's going to lead to, now the cervix is actually a portion of the uterus itself. It's a region of the uterus, and then that leads to the vagina. So those are classified as the ducts of the female reproductive system. A few more features of the fallopian or the uterine tubes. The inner lining of a fallopian tube has cilia along it, little hair-like projections that help brush the ovulated oocyte along. And also there's smooth muscle tissue in the walls of the fallopian tubes, and that contraction causes a type of peristalsis to occur, kind of like you have in your along your intestinal tract, and that helps squeeze the oocyte along as well. Do keep in mind the usual site of fertilization where sperm will find an oocyte is inside a fallopian tube. That's the usual site where that occurs. So as I mentioned back when we were covering the male reproductive system, I talked about how those sperm have a long way to go. They have a pretty long journey from where they get deposited to where they might find an egg. All right, and we talked about the widened portion, the infundibulum section of the fallopian tube, where it widens, and then you have those fimbriae, those finger-like projections that wrap around the ovary and are there to help capture the oocyte as it gets ovulated. Okay, some homeostatic imbalances of these ducts. An ectopic pregnancy, you've probably heard of that before. An ectopic pregnancy is where sometimes when an oocyte gets fertilized by a sperm, as I mentioned, sometimes that might happen in the peritoneal cavity, and then the pregnancy might develop attached to a different organ in the abdominopelvic cavity. Or sometimes in a distal portion of the uterine tube. So the implant of the fallopian tube or uterine tube rather than in the uterus. And those are normally going to abort naturally, but there will be a lot of bleeding. There's some risk for hemorrhage in the female, and also it can cause the uterine tube to rupture, which can cause a problem if the fallopian tube ruptures over on one side. Now the female is just left with one that's functional, so that could impact future attempts at getting pregnant. You may have also heard before of pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. This is where you may have this is often caused by STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, where you have an infection along the vaginal lining, for example, that winds up spreading up into the uterus and up through the fallopian tubes, and it can even exit from there into the peritoneal cavity, which is not a good thing. You are not supposed to have microorganisms inside your peritoneal cavity. And the inflammation that develops from this, as we've talked a little bit about before, one of the events of inflammation is tissue repair, and a lot of times tissue repair leads to scar tissue formation. So the tissues that replace the original tissues are kind of dense and fibrous connective type tissues, and if that scar tissue completely blocks the lumen of a fallopian tube, for example, that could result in infertility if it happens on both sides. All right, how about the uterus? The uterus is the womb, and of course it's hollow, has a thick wall, so you're learning that terminology like endometrium and myometrium and perimetrium over on the anatomy side. You have those different layers, but the thickest layer is the myometrium. Kind of like you had the thickest layer, the myocardium of the heart. Same deal in the uterus, except instead of cardiac muscle, you have smooth muscle in there that's capable of contraction. Contraction is needed for menstruation and also for delivery of an infant. All right, what is the uterus's main function? To allow implantation of a developing embryo, a fertilized ovum, and to nourish it. Three major regions, as you've learned about over on the anatomy side. The body, that's the main portion. The fundus is the dome up at the top. And the fundus is what gets palpated or felt by medical personnel when it's one of the things that can be used to sort of estimate how advanced a pregnancy has moved along, or it's also used as a way of measuring whether a pregnancy is proceeding as expected size-wise. Then the cervix, that's the portion of the uterus that's like a neck that connects the body of the uterus to the vagina. It projects down into the vagina. Now within there, the narrow passageway is called the cervical canal, and it has two openings. The opening into the uterus is called the internal os, and the opening into the vagina is called the external os. The cervix does have glands embedded within it that secrete mucus, and we talked a little bit about those over on the male side of things. That mucus creates a plug over the external os, and that prevents additional sperm from entering into the cervix and on into the uterus and up further into the fallopian tubes, except when around the time of ovulation. Ovulation occurs around the middle of a female's monthly cycle, and so that's actually the only time when sperm really need to be moving beyond the vagina and up into the fallopian tubes, where an ovulated ovum may be waiting for them. Homeostatic imbalance of the uterus, an important one is cervical cancer. So we hear about this quite a bit. 450,000 women develop cervical cancer each year, kills about half of them. So this is a big-time health concern for females. Most common between the ages of 30 and 50. What puts you at a higher risk? Frequent cervical inflammations, STIs, that's another abbreviation for STD, that stands for sexually transmitted infection. Actually, multiple pregnancies increase your risk for cervical cancer as well. Cervical inflammation, if you have like frequent infections along the vaginal lining that also affect the cervix, anytime you have inflammation, those epithelial tissues undergo mitosis. They divide in order to replace the damaged ones. And any mitotic tissues that divide more frequently, they're more likely to undergo the genetic mutations that lead to cancer. That's why cancers usually develop in epithelial tissues. Cancers in other types of tissues in the body are are pretty rare. All right, no doubt you've heard of a pap smear, which is an abbreviation for Papa Nicolau. That's a Greek guy who developed this detection technique for cervical cancer where some tissue is sampled off of the cervix and checked to see if there are any cancerous cells that are present. It can be discontinued generally at age 65 if it's been negative for 10 years. There's been nothing unusual there. And pretty recently, vaccines have become available. Gardasil is one of them that can be used to help prevent infections with HPV. That stands for human papilloma virus. And these cause genital warts. And there are some strains of HPV that down the road can trigger cervical cells to become cancerous and develop into cervical cancers. And so the Gardasil vaccine helps protect against the strains that are the most likely to cause cervical cancer. And those are also HPV, human papillomavirus, also causes penile cancers in males. It causes pharyngeal cancers of the throat as well. And so these vaccines that are available are designed to help protect against those infections. And will hopefully down the road, now that we've had we've had several years of teenagers receiving these vaccinations, hopefully down the road we'll see that there is a decrease in these various types of cancers that are caused by human papillomavirus. The uterine wall, as you've learned over on the anatomy side, but just to review here, because we're going to be talking a lot about the endometrium, that's the inner lining here of the uterus. The muscular wall, the thickest portion, is the myometrium that consists of a contractile smooth muscle. And then the perimetrium covers the outside of the uterus, and really that's the visceral peritoneum. So that's all it is, but it's called the perimetrium in the case of the uterus. Okay, the vagina is a thinner walled tube. It is muscular, but it's not as thick and muscular as the uterus, usually about 8 to 10 centimeters in length. And this can also be called the birth canal, and it's also the organ of copulation. And we've already taken a look at how it's positioned between the bladder and the rectum when we were looking at the cross-section of the female reproductive anatomy. The urethra is anterior for female. If you think about a female standing up in anatomical position, the urethra is anterior. And it's also actually embedded into the anterior wall of the vagina. These structures are linked together. There is a structure called the hymen, which you've likely heard about before. That is part of the mucosal lining of the vagina that branches off the sides and actually forms an almost complete covering over just beyond the vaginal orifice. The vaginal orifice is going to be the opening to the outside of the body, and that ruptures with the first sexual intercourse. And that hymen, now there are other things that can rupture the hymen as well. So you may have heard before that a female can't be a virgin if her hymen has been ruptured, and that's not necessarily true. There are other things that can rupture that structure as well. Okay, then collectively all of the external structures of the female anatomy are called the vulva. And again, this is a rehash of what you're covering over on the anatomy side. So just review those structures. But the vulva includes the labia majora. Those are the larger external folds or lips of the vulva. And if you part those back, like you see here in this diagram, there are inner folds. They're called the labia minora. Here's the vaginal orifice. Here's the anus down in here. And when a female is in this position, if you look upward, that opening right there is the external urethral orifice. So those are the three openings in the female. And just above there, in this view, now if a woman is in an anatomical position, think about how these different structures are oriented. Going this way is going anterior. And here's the clitoris. The clitoris can also be called the glans, but typically it's called the clitoris. And that is erectile. It's composed of erectile tissues that fill up with blood, just like the spongy tissues in the penis of a male do during sexual excitement. The clitoris does have a prepuce, which is analogous to the foreskin over the glands of the penis. And that's sometimes called the clitoral hood. Let's see. And then the mountain of fatty tissue on which the pubic hair is located as well is called the mons pubis in a female. The mons pubis overlies the pubic symphysis. Interestingly, the labia majora, so we talked about how these different structures in a developing embryo, there are male structures that are analogous to female structures. So the labia majora, the outer folds of the vulva in a female, are actually the counterpart of the male scrotum. So under the influence of testosterone, these structures will descend further away from the body and will become pouches for the testes. The labia minora are those inner folds that cover the vestibule. That's a term. A lot of students have trouble with vestibule when they're learning the female reproductive anatomy. So let me highlight the vestibule for you. So if you pull back the labia majora and the labia minora, you have a surface right in here. You have this surface, and that's where your external urethral orifice is located. That's where the vaginal orifice is located. These two little holes here are the openings of the vestibular glands, which secrete lubricating fluid in a female. And so that surface right in there on which those openings are located is called the vestibule. Those greater vestibular glands or vestibular glands, they are analogous or homologous to the bulbourethral glands in a male. So this is what these, in a female, these structures will develop into the vestibular glands. In a male, under the influence of testosterone, they're going to become the bulbourethral glands. Perform more or less the same functions. The bulbourethral glands produce a lubricating fluid that covers the glands of the penis, helps lubricate for sexual intercourse, and the same thing happens with these glands in a female. It provides lubrication. Let's see, and then we already talked about the clitoris and its functions. Okay, we'll have a short lecture 11 on the mammary glands, which are part of the female reproductive system, since they're going to be important for producing milk to nourish an infant. So we'll have a short lecture on the mammary glands and their function, and then we're going to move on and start talking more about the complex interplay between hormones that controls oocyte development, follicle development, and the changes along the endometrium each month as a female progresses through her monthly cycles.